the dystopia that we have been talking about in the West. And when you look at 2030 roadmap between Israel and the UK, all of this technology is being developed on the back of the genocide of Palestinians, but it's going to be used against us. We need to make the connection between what is happening in West Asia, what the resistance is trying to do, because the resistance are aware of Netanyahu's vision of a new order. They're very aware of it. And they literally feel they are fighting this war for everybody.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me again today, and it's been a long hiatus. I haven't seen her in a while. Vanessa Beeley, always honored to have her on the show because she is so immersed in these topics, always has more insight, more in-depth, objective, nonpartisan information than pretty much anybody else out there. Bring it on today to discuss kind of what's going on in the Middle East, her perspectives on Lebanon, Gaza, all the different overlaps, Syria, and kind of just see how she perceives a lot of what's happening. And we can talk about Zionism and influence on the upcoming selection, conversations about just different dynamics, the blocking of aid and so on. We have plenty of things to cover today. So Vanessa, how are you? It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, hi, Ryan. It's always nice to be back on with you. And yeah, it has been too long. So it's really good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're doing good. I mean, I know you're always putting yourself in dangerous positions, so it's nice to see that you're doing well. So where are you right now? And if you want to get into that, then what are you currently?
I mean, I'm in Damascus, which is relatively calm, although of course Israel did bomb central Damascus a couple of times in the last 2 weeks, carrying out attempted assassinations, and of course in the process killing civilians and destroying residential apartments in the center of one of the busiest areas of Damascus. And the last attack, of course, was at one of the busiest times. But we also know that what Israel is trying to do with the potential of increasing or escalating the aggression in Syria is, of course, it has been bombing various areas in central, coastal Syria, southern Syria, basically trying to clear a pathway through the air defense and radar, early warning radar systems. And right now, of course, in collusion with Israel, we have a new front that has actually been, sorry, I've got a noisy cat for 2 seconds, that's being basically launched by Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as they're now known, of course. They've been rebranded multiple times in the northwest, in Idlib. And so the Syrian Arab Army has been mobilizing to the northwest to try and deal with really an expansion of that aggression, or let's say a reignition of that aggression, with Ukrainian backing now, alongside US and Turkish. Turkey is basically providing surveillance. It has military bases in the northwest and in the north, where it's annexing effectively Syrian territory, and is using as a proxy what were formerly known as the Free Syrian Army, that are now known as the Syrian National Army. I always get so mixed up with all of the new monikers that they put on them to try and disguise the fact it's the same guys, So, Syria, as I say, Syria isn't seeing the real heat of the battle yet, but it's, we're kind of bracing ourselves because here people know that what stands between escalation here is Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. So the war in Lebanon is sort of pivotal to what happens next in Syria, basically.
Well, so a few things on Syria since we start there. In regard to the larger perspective. Well, actually, first, before we get to that, how it fits into everything. So it's interesting. So we're talking about Idlib yet again, right? So for those that may not have watched our many different interviews over the years of this discussion, or your work over it, or just the Brett McGurk himself highlighting it as the biggest hotspot for Al-Qaeda, so explain how that fits in today. So we're talking about a location that the U.S. is working through today with other foreign partners through Idlib.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the US is working basically, you can go from the south up the eastern border into the northeast. The north is pretty much central northern areas are under the control of Turkey and its proxy forces. But of course, Turkey is a NATO member state. And then into the northwest, you've got Abu Mohammed Jolani, who, if you remember, PBS tried to kind of normalize him, put him in a suit and brush him up a bit and make him look human. But this guy was formerly with ISIS, then Al-Qaeda or Nusra Front, and then basically, as I said, it was rebranded into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It formed the Salvation government. So in other words, you know, the West was trying to present this as a legitimate opposition to the legitimate Syrian government and the internationally recognized Syrian government.
Well, so just really, so for those that are, you know, because I'm in a really positive way, we do have a lot of new people in these conversations and new eyes on these conversations that have never been here before, and really in a really positive way. And whether that's because of the COVID-19 illusion or the, you know, kind of dissolving conversation around Zionism. So on that point, somebody who may be confused by going, wait, did she just say ISIS? And so you know, I know this is for us really tough territory, right? So, but we're talking about an ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and you're saying that the U.S. government is working with these assets, correct? And this location is where they're, as even Brett McGurk not too long ago said, one of the biggest hotspots in the area. So just explain why that is the case for those that might be shocked to hear you say that they're working alongside U.S. entities.
Well, basically, I mean, ISIS grew out of what was really Al-Qaeda in Iraq and from, you know, the black sites, the CIA black sites in Iraq. And they were given, let's say, the time period in order to be incubated, in order to form the organization and so on by the US. You know, this is a pretty well-known fact. And then, of course, they were used, yes, they were weaponized, both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as proxies of the US to overthrow the Syrian government. Now, in 2016, in September, John Kerry, under the Obama administration, Secretary of State, was recorded in a closed session at the UN speaking to Syrian opposition activists, and that's a euphemism. Terrorist adjuncts, let's say, including the White Helmet organization that was midwifed by the CIA and the MI6 in order to, let's say, give a humanitarian cover to the terrorist groups and also to provide the propaganda, including the chemical weapons, fabricated staged events that were used to criminalize the Syrian government and Russia. And in that closed session, what he basically says was they allowed ISIS to flourish because they believed that ISIS would be able to overthrow the Syrian government. So that was a very clear admission.
Right. And I was going to say really quickly, make sure you check out the many different interviews that Vanessa's had around the world, but with T-Level alone, about the white helmets, about the reality of all of this. Just on a side note, I recommend you take a deep dive back on a lot of her work and we've talked about, because all this stuff is not new information, but for some people it may be shocking. But so with, you know, Al-Tam for the Al-Rukban camp or whatever, that location and Idlib, we're talking about sort of the control of the flow through land bridges and so on, and really just working alongside the terrorists, right? The moderate rebels. And so that's interesting for new people to see. And so in that context, we're talking about that little dynamic working with Israel. So how does that play in the larger picture of what people are seeing who may kind of just be waking up to some of these foreign policy dynamics, right? So we see Israel occupy the occupation of Palestine, the ongoing situation there, occupying Lebanon, occupying parts of Syria. So what's Israel's design in this, and why is it suddenly relevant to the ongoing Middle East conversation?
Well, if you go back to 1997 and the clean break doctrine that was commissioned by Netanyahu back then, so he's effectively been in control of these events largely for the past 3 decades. Now, the clean break doctrine talked openly about destroying Iraq as the road to Damascus, destabilizing Damascus, effectively partitioning the region, bringing, let's say, less radical, this is Israel's language, Arab Sunni Muslim states like the Gulf states, like Jordan, like Egypt on board. In other words, normalization with those nations to prevent them from joining the resistance axis to end the Zionist occupation in the region. And then, you know, it's a very long and convoluted history, but, you know, I'm going to really try to kind of condense it down. But effectively, what is Syria? Syria is the backbone of the resistance axis. So that resistance axis runs from, if you imagine it, like literally a spine. So from Palestine through Lebanon, through Syria, into Iraq, and then into Iran. And of course, Yemen is also included in that track. Now, Syria is the central hub. It's the central land bridge. It is literally the spine of the resistance. And that's why this war was started in 2011, to break the spine, to destroy that land bridge where Iran and other players can supply the resistance with arms, even with humanitarian aid, of course, with oil, because the US is occupying Syrian oil and agricultural resources in the northeast and even in the northwest under Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda have a monopoly on the processing of the oil that is being stolen by the US and its proxies, whether ISIS or now, of course, the Kurdish separatists known as the YPG or the SDF. And so for Israel, it was always incredibly important to bring Syria to heel. Now, after 9/11, Tony Blair and George W. Bush attempted to do it through, let's say, courting President Assad, trying to bring him into the fold, trying to attract him to the Qatari pipeline instead of the Russian-backed Iranian oil pipeline, which of course he turned down in 2009. And from then on, basically, the insurgents against the Syrian government was planned. And the overthrow was planned because the courting of Assad didn't work. He wouldn't relinquish the Palestinian cause. He wouldn't force Hezbollah to leave Syrian territory, where many of them had established themselves after the Nakba in 1948, when 750,000 plus Palestinians were ethnically cleansed by the Zionists. And so therefore, the regime change war began on behalf of Israel. And Israel has consistently provided weapons to the armed groups. It's provided medical treatment to the armed groups. I even went to the south and saw, when it was basically liberated, and saw the hospitals that Israel had built on the border to treat the armed groups. Those hospitals were then dismantled, but strewn all over the ground was Israeli labeled pharmaceuticals and equipment that had been left behind in the rush to sort of get out of there. So Israel has from the beginning supported the destabilization and the partitioning of Syria, and therefore, of course, it supported the Kurdish separatist settlement in the northeast, because if you look at the map of Greater Israel, and people may not be aware of what this means, but effectively, the Zionist movement has always historically been an expansionist movement. And it has always perceived, I mean, we're seeing a lot more of that language now from Smotrich and Ben Gvir, that they believe it is their historical and religious right to expand their territory into 3/4 of Syria, leaving the northeastern section, which of course then explains why the US and the Kurds are occupying the territory east of the Euphrates, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, sections of Turkey even, I believe, will become, and of course Lebanon and Palestine, that goes without saying, will become Greater Israel. And so therefore, what, you know, in my opinion, what we are seeing now is the attempted realization of this project to effectively take control of all territories. In Palestine, that's definitely what we're seeing. We'll talk about what's going on in Gaza with the separation of the north from the central and southern parts of the strip, because that's an Ariel Sharon, Five Fingers Plan project. that is now being kind of reintroduced, in my opinion. And then, of course, Lebanon, what's going on in Lebanon. It's not only a war against Hezbollah, it's a war to recapture the territory that they lost in 2000 and 2006. And in my opinion, to take control of Lebanon entirely, and then to expand into Syria.
So on the Syrian point, so you basically, as you just described, so this is a war that the U.S. government and its allies are fighting on behalf of Israel, at least from Israel's perspective, to see to fruition its greater Israel project. And so this is a very easily verifiable reality that it's interesting how few people actually know this, as they're pointing at all their adversaries saying they want to, Hamas will take over the world if we let them out of Gaza. It's while they're actively doing this, or the Azov movement for that matter, that they also fund, who has the same mentality from a different perspective. So that's really fascinating. I think that's important for average people who are just kind of introduced to this topic to recognize how the U.S. is being used in that way. So last point on Syria, unless you have any other aspects you want to bring into it.
Sure.
How is Russia playing a factor in this? I guess, and the main point being, people often ask why they would allow, or Syria wouldn't respond, or would continue to allow these unjustified illegal attacks on Syria with little response. And if it goes further to the point where you're saying it seems to do, what do you think, in your opinion, would Russia do, if anything?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I get asked very often. And the problem is, what people need to be aware of is that Zionist media is very good at planting the seeds of doubt, right? Like recently, there was a report that the Russians had evacuated their watchtowers or bases in the south. Now, this was complete nonsense. What actually was happening was one guard was leaving and another was replacing it. So it had nothing to do with them actually evacuating. But always the problem is this gets released into kind of chosen, aligned Arab media, and then it gets picked up even by friendly media. And it, before you know it, everyone's thinking Russia's abandoning Syria in the south, And the same thing happened with the air defenses when, I don't know if you remember, but Russia removed one air defense system. I think it was from near Masyaf, so in kind of close to the Hama Homs area, kind of central western Syria. But the reality is they didn't need it in that area anymore. And the chances are, I haven't actually verified yet, but everybody was saying to me, I think they're actually going to update it. So again, this rumor that they were sending their air defenses from Syria to Ukraine. And interestingly, there's another rumor going around today that's even been picked up by Syrian accounts saying that, oh God, all the Hezbollah troops are leaving Syria to go back to Lebanon. No, they're not. Or, the 40,000 Yemeni soldiers that were supposed to have arrived in Syria. And I kept saying to people, how do you think 40,000 troops are going to enter a very, very, very small border crossing at Al Bukamal that is the only part that isn't under the control of the United States and its various terrorist proxies, and not surveilled? Well, it is surveilled by Israel, and Israel regularly bombs this area. How are 40,000 troops going to enter this area, cross the all of Syria, and go to an area that is occupied by Israel? This is the problem. These kind of rumors get generated. And unfortunately, people don't engage their own rationale.
Right.
If a trusted account puts this information out, they're like, oh my God, do you know what I mean? Right. And I'm not criticizing people for this. If I'm criticizing anyone, it's those accounts, those influencer accounts that are putting the information out without any verification, without any fact checking at all. And people, I genuinely say this from the heart, people really need to be aware of this and to verify information with trusted sources that are on the ground, who know exactly what is going on, or who can ask. There's a lot of sensationalism going on. Sorry, I've kind of diverged
No,
from your actual question.
it's a very important point. Go ahead. I was going to comment. Keep going.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Just that point is very important today, and I think that it's. I would argue, like to your point, the secondary part is that it's. I think we've been engineered to be in this position. Twitter files is a great example of how they sort of engineered or drove us or a lot of people to exactly that and take screenshots at face value because of the trusted source. And so it kind of engineer people to think that's what you're supposed to do, and other examples of that. And so, yes, we do need, that's what question everything. That's our motto is all about, right? That's how it's always should have been. It doesn't mean to ignore anything, but just, you got to apply the equal skepticism even to people you trust, because we could just be wrong, but and I think it's being engineered that way for very obvious reasons, because as you say, it's an important tactic to dump this kind of stuff in a conversation, like Russia's leaving, and all of a sudden it can ultimately snowball into real world effects, where people then make their choices based on that being real, and then more people do leave, and they know this, and so it's important right now more than ever, as you're highlighting, whether it's Israel or anybody else. The U.S. government seems to be the primary, frankly, Israel's propaganda is pretty weak in most regards, how it ever affected work that anybody, it blows my mind, but the U.S. government is really good about constantly dumping these things in the field, and I see the partisan conversation going wild today. So I think it's a really good point for people to resonate on and see how it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Please continue.
Yeah, just take a deep breath before you share information, basically. But coming back to Russia, I mean, recently there was an attack which I think was a combined Israeli terrorist attack. So the terrorists in Idlib were sending drones, and Israel was attacking from the Mediterranean. Although I have a slight theory on. And it is totally a theory. It's totally speculation. It's just, NATO has been building up troops on Cyprus, and Cyprus is very close to the coastal areas of Syria. Because I was really questioning, how is Israel managing to be bombing Gaza, bombing West Bank, bombing Lebanon, bombing Syria, on multiple occasions, simultaneously. And I did start to wonder whether US, UK are actually directly getting involved in carrying out attacks on behalf of Israel without admitting it.
Would surprise me.
Yeah, because they are obviously in Yemen. But anyway, so during that attack, there was a warehouse which was attacked very close to the Haimamin base, which is the Russian, basically a naval base, but also a military base. On the coastal area of Tartus. And Russian air defenses were engaged. And I know that immediately after the attack, which went on for about 2 hours, there were Russian jets patrolling the coast, looking for any enemy planes. And what people need to understand, there's two things. One is Russia respects the sovereignty of Syria. So to a large degree, in collaboration with Damascus. So everything is done through negotiation with Damascus and discussion at a military level, at a diplomatic level, at a political level, at an economic level. Nothing is done without the partnership of Damascus. So in my opinion, Russia has a policy that the Syrian air defense is actually very capable of bringing down the majority of the Israeli missiles. And so it's hands off. But at the same time, they are helping behind the scenes to develop the equipment that Syria has, to provide updated equipment, etc. And on multiple occasions, they have buzzed American and Israeli planes or drones. They brought down American drones, but out of Syrian airspace. So they have a kind of very low-key role. And one thing Russia is very, very bad at is self-publicity. It doesn't do it, and I don't understand why not. It doesn't understand the importance of altering people's perceptions. It really doesn't. It's really bad at this.
It's an interesting point, though, in this day and age. Like, I've always seen, I do my best to try to keep it as a, I think I'm anti-government, let's put it that way. So I have a hard time. I don't see it as good guy, bad guy, but I see at the same time, though, that Putin in particular, or their government's actions in general, have consistently shown themselves to be very strategic, very measured. They're not responding to all of the clumsy, belligerent actions of what we've been seeing from our foreign policy. I see that constantly. And so to me, I would almost reflect on that as recognizing where we are today. Because you come out and you say something about yourself, it almost gets perceived as the opposite by people who are already been kind of seeded against you in certain perspective. Like, I almost see in a way that if you don't do it, people then see that as a positive. I guess that would just be my first, I guess what I'm saying in the larger sense is that Russia's shown itself to be so strategic in these ways that it doesn't fall into these traps, and in a way thinking 2 steps ahead when the US and Israel are sort of reacting to everything that's happening. And I would see that in that kind of line. Do you think that makes sense at all?
Yeah, and I think, what people maybe miss is that, I understand being against governments, but the fact is that when you pivot east, you do have real statesmen and women. You do have real spokespeople. We used to have them in the West, but I mean, I can't pinpoint at which point it just deteriorated into clownland, basically.
I could give a good guess.
Yeah. But it's true. We don't have, whether you agree with them or not. I remember watching Tony Benn and Heath and people, and de Gaulle and Chirac, but you didn't have to agree with them, but at least they were statesmen.
Yeah. At
least they had opinions.
That's
you
kind of my
see
point.
The hand behind them, kind of.
Right. Well, it's kind of my point about Russia in general is that, it doesn't, you can praise the action and the statesmanship, I guess the word, in without it being like they're the good guy versus the bad guy. I just think it's important to keep it out of that from a journalistic perspective, which, but so I agree with you though. And I think that they've represented themselves. It's always the question of whether these are actions from a government that are, like reading the room. Anybody that's aware can see the belligerence of the U.S. government it could, maybe they're acting in good intention for their people, or they recognize that it's advantageous to play that role. Either way, it's a positive thing. They're doing the right thing, as it were. So I think that's important to see. And I think that what the reactions are, in my opinion, would be that it's, why come out with all of the showmanship when I feel like I sense too that nobody buys it anymore. Everybody leans into it because they have an agenda, or they're hate the other side, and then everybody else is kind of like, they're all lying. That's the sense I get today. That's anyway, how I would read it.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I think, Russia is very aware of what's going on. And of course, it has vested interests in Syria. So it's in Russia's interest to eventually defend their interests in Syria. And Absolutely. I think now what we are seeing is a kind of a diffusing of the borders between the wars. So now you've got Ukrainian advisors, military advisors coming into Idlib to train, the Al-Qaeda forces there. They've also been in the northeast, according to reports about a year ago, I think, again, to try and work with the Kurdish separatists there. And that's under the auspices of the US, of course, and the UK, and then, that entire kind of alliance of regime change. And so the war from Ukraine is, if you like, now, it had already been low-key spilling into Syria because there were so many mercenaries, both foreign mercenaries and terrorist mercenaries, going from Syria to fight in Ukraine because the money's better. Right. But now you've got Ukraine coming into Syria, training, providing weapons, providing technology, providing equipment. I mean, the latest kind of PR video put out by the armed groups in Idlib just looks like Ukraine, from the uniforms to the weapons to the training.
To the ISIS patches that they catch on the videos.
Yeah, no, they've all got kind of different colored bandanas on to make them look as if they're Al-Qaeda. I mean, it really does become. I've seen
at least 4 videos where, and there's even one, I'm sure you've seen the CNN one where they even eventually blurted out where the guy's doing a Sig Heil in the middle of the street, but you can see like ISIS patches. It's very real. You're catching them all over the place, But so just on a quick, before we jump into Gaza, how is that not regarded as a world war? Just as an interesting, ridiculous point. Like any other metric in the past, we've ever argued World War I, World War II, like You're just describing the bleed over on these. We're in the midst of World War III. I mean, that's not meant to be like we should all be scared. I mean, there are reasons to be concerned, obviously, but I think we should acknowledge that that's not some kind of line that's about to be crossed. That's been going on for a long time. Would you agree with that?
No, it's, yeah, I mean, it's really been going on for a long time, even before Ukraine, because if you imagine all the players that were fighting each other in Syria,
exactly.
Right? I mean, you had Iran, you had China, you have still Russia, you have the Gulf states, you have Israel, you have the US, the UK, the EU. I mean, it's endless. What was it? I mean, tens of countries involved in the regime change war against Syria. It was insane. You know?
Well, shows you how important it is to the larger agenda.
That was a sort of low intensity world war already. That's before you brought Ukraine in and the threats against China. And now, of course, the ramping up of rhetoric against Iran. Israel's preparing to retaliate, although, under international law, Iran retaliated for the attacks that Israel carried out against the embassy here in Damascus, which, by the way, killed a number of civilians and injured many others, including 2 friends of mine, and then the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So, no one ever says to Israel, "Can you stop?" The messaging always goes out to Iran or to Yemen or to Lebanon. Please don't retaliate. Don't do anything. Just let Israel come in, steal your territory, bomb your homes, kill your civilians, massacre your children, burn them alive. But, please don't do anything about it. Just let them get on with it.
Well, I mean, there's no way to misunderstand how they present this every time. It's, immediately, how dare you don't, everyone has got a right to defend themselves. And the moment it's their turn, no, don't, you better not, or now you're terrorists. Even when confronted with this multiple times, I think it might have been Brent Thackeray, forget who it was in the State Department, but Matt Miller put to it, does Iran have a right to defend itself? And the way that they so clumsily try to avoid and eventually even get put to it and make the point that no, they really don't, because they're terrorists. That might have been, I forget his name now, the Indian guy, I forget his name. What is he? No, not Kirby. No, the other State Department guy. But either way, the point was basically, that basically they get cornered because of the way this is what I love about some of the people in that room these days. They really are doing a good job trying to they corner them logically, right? And then you kind of get screwed, and they have to argue that, well, they don't have a right to defend themselves because they're terrorists. And then it comes back to the idea that then you just get to arbitrarily name people terrorists, So let's bring this into Gaza, because I think this is obviously, at least from the world perspective, but I would agree it is a central kind of linchpin to a lot of what's happening from Israel's perspective, from the way the U.S. is involved. So I guess let's just start with what the current updates. I think my audience is very involved and aware of what's been going on, for 76 years in general, but since October 7th. So, what do you want to get into with Gaza? You started with the partition plan. We can talk about that and the kind of about to be retaken. It's always been occupied, but that whole effort, the surrender or starve plan. Go ahead and start wherever you'd like.
Well, I mean, I think now it's becoming increasingly clear that, Netanyahu's dystopian plan for Gaza that I wrote about and spoke about extensively, they are still on track for this, and many people kind of dismissed it as it was just, a totally out there concept. But the reality is what you're seeing now with this partitioning off of the north in Jabalia, for example, and the usage of the, God, my mind's just gone blank, the Netvarim corridor, which transverses east to west, is basically being re-established as the kind of hideous divide between north and south that it always used to be, where there were checkpoints and there were daily, abuse and murder of Palestinians trying to cross from the south to the north. This was when there were settlers still inside Gaza, of course, before Ariel Sharon withdrew them all. And now Ariel Sharon had an original plan for Gaza, which was to divide it into 5 fingers, he called it. It was known as the 5-finger plan. So he was going to divide it into 5 cantons, where the Palestinians that were living there were totally under control of the settlers, the armed settlers, as we know, the ISIS settlers, as they call them, and the Zionist military. Now, of course, the plan has evolved into the cantons will be created, everything will be destroyed inside those cantons, and the Palestinians that want to remain will be put into what are effectively mini Gazas, closed settlements, under the control of what the plan is described as an Arab army. So you're talking about UAE, Jordan. I mean, they're all denying it at the moment. They're all kind of saying, no, 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 no. But I think it was UAE that came forward and kind of said, well, they might consider it now. So, you know, this is just rhetoric. These kind of denials mean nothing to me, because these people are on board. These countries are on board. These leaderships are on board. The Abraham Accords that were brought in under President Trump's administration were effectively a continuation of the Oslo agreements, which totally depoliticized the Palestinian cause, enabled further theft of Palestinian territory. And what the Abraham Accords did, of course, is to normalize relations with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. Egypt had already done that under Sadat back in '79 with the Camp David Agreement. I mean, Egypt's another thing altogether. I call it the Ukraine of West Asia. It's completely sold out. It's not a sovereign country anymore, in my opinion.
Its people seem to
course,
recognize that. Would you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big danger for Israel, because the people in these countries are really angry now.
Right.
Because even though they may not necessarily be, for example, pro-Hamas or pro elements of the resistance, like they've been brainwashed into fearing Iran's expansionism, for example, and the threat of Shia Islam. But what they are now seeing is a normalization with an entity that is carrying out an hourly, minute-by-minute genocide in some of the most appalling, satanic, sadistic ways possible. And it's doing so with impunity. It's just nothing is happening. The entire international community is completely powerless to prevent this. And we knew this anyway, to be honest. I mean, anyone that was actually expecting the ICC or the ICJ or the UN or OCHA or UNRWA to be able to counter this are completely, living in another dimension, because it was obvious they were not going to do anything. The only purpose that this might serve is in the future, bringing these people, these criminals, to justice. That if the right people are in charge and are in control, and that's another whole question altogether. So basically, this is Netanyahu's intention and for Gaza. And if you remember at the UNGA, he held up the blessings and the curse map. And you can see clearly there, actually, if people didn't understand what the curse was exactly, that is Greater Israel. So those are the countries that offer an existential threat to the existence of Israel. The blessing was the India-Middle East economic corridor. So going from Mumbai through the Gulf states, through Gaza, into Al Arish in Egypt, and then to Europe. And so what Gaza then becomes is a free trade zone where Israel can use Palestinian gas, it can develop industry, it can use Palestinians as effectively slave labor, right? Those that remain and agree to give up resistance. And people need to understand that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain are now introducing into their educational curriculum normalization with the Zionist entity. So they're ceasing to present any true history of Palestine right now in schools, in school curriculum, in those normalized countries, which is extraordinary. And again, under the Trump administration, Netanyahu closed to public access all the archives relating to the Nakba. He also brought into the constitution apartheid. He made it a constitutional law. He legalized apartheid, which is just, I mean, it's absolutely criminal. Apart from everything else that Trump did to empower Israel, that was something, okay, you can argue, well, Netanyahu did that. Yes, but he did that. You know, you can't divide the two. You can't divide Israeli policy from US policy. It doesn't work because they're running in complete parallel. So, you know, that's the plan for Gaza. And the thing is that a lot of people try to present Netanyahu as some crazy, irrational, nihilistic, genocidal guy. No, this is the strategy. He has a strategy, and he's working towards that strategy very deliberately.
And so this was always, I mean, going back even historically, I mean, as you even kind of just briefly mentioned, if and correct me if I'm wrong, Gaza was the kind of like this central hub for transaction for commerce, I guess, right? Historically, and that's correct, right? The location
as Palestine, as part of Palestine. You
I'm sorry, I said Gaza. Yes, Palestine is what I meant in general. That was sort of
because that was the port. That was, I mean, there are several ports in Palestine, obviously, but Gaza was a main thoroughfare.
And this is all arguably why, you know, Israel is this is one of those central locations. I mean, obviously a lot more going on there, but I just think about that in the larger conversation. And so Gaza is occupied and has been before 2005, and it is after 2005. So now what we're seeing is this partition, which, I mean, it's just on its face about populating that location. So I think what's important, as I was bringing up a second ago, in case anybody missed it for the podcast, even Haaretz just posted this on the 16th. Netanyahu's Likud party issues invitation to event titled Preparing to Settle Gaza. And for those that have been following along, as Arnaud Bertrand is highlighting, that we should, this is worthy of ridicule. One, how obvious the contradiction, how your governments in the world ignore this, that Netanyahu at the UN last month, we don't seek to resettle Gaza. Now in Congress in July, Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza. And then today we're seeking to resettle Gaza. The point is, we should have always seen this coming if we're paying attention. As Vanessa's outlining, this has been the plan. This is the plan. And there's always been, different ways they've been trying to achieve it. But so bringing this to the part about the right of return and UNRWA and how the aid aspect and all these different kind of overlapping points to this, can you explain that in detail for people, like what we're talking about in regard to why the focus of UNRWA, why that's so important for Israel to kind of remove from the conversation, and the right of return? Can you just, I guess just briefly, if you will, just kind of explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the right of return is absolutely criminal. I mean, indigenous peoples that were driven out from their own land and their own homes from even before 1948. 1948 is known as the Nakba and the ethnic cleansing catastrophe. But of course, this was ongoing from 1917 onwards, even earlier to some degree, with the the exodus of Jews, European Jews, from Europe for various reasons into Palestine. And then eventually, when those Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their own lands and homes and farms and so on, they were given no right to return. No Palestinian has the right to return to their own lands. But anybody who converts to Judaism in any country in the world can come to Israel. And actually, just as an aside, that is why it's known as a hub for pedophiles, because people who have faced prosecution in the US or in the EU or even in the UK for pedophilia, for example, or child abuse, have simply converted to Judaism and have been happily welcomed into Israel. This is a known fact. It's a documented fact, even by Israeli media. I'm not kind of making this up. I have written about it extensively. Right. And then, sorry, what was the other thing you said?
Oh, so I'll bring this up. This is important to make sure people hear that this is. It's funny how it's not funny, but it's frustrating how very easily proven things, even from Israeli media, can be so shocking, so just blindly dismissed by people. And it shows you how controlled this conversation is. This from Haaretz, Israel becoming a refuge for pedophiles, Warren's advocate for child sex abuse victims. But so the point in general is, so the right of return for Palestinians, the idea that,
Oh, and UNRWA, you mentioned.
yeah, well, just so the idea that being any occupation or any supposed legal ongoing war, that people can get displaced, and the reality is they're supposed to be given the right to come back to their homes after that's over. But Israel, of course, never gave back the territory it occupied, and so where the UNRWA was created to sort of to be the keeper of the records, right, to make sure that we know who's how. As you know, some people still have the keys to these homes, which New York. People from New York are living in these occupied territories. And so what I want you to kind of touch on for me is the interest, the importance to that in regard to what Israel's trying to accomplish, and, like why they're going after UNRWA. And then I was going to bring that into the point about the person you mentioned in your recent post about Sinwar and the overlap there. But just first, why are they going after UNRWA? What's the focal point for Israel there?
Well, I mean, I think basically, UNRWA is the sole refugee agency that is basically providing humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and also in Lebanon, of course, because people forget. I mean, the Burj Barajneh camp that has recently been bombed by Israel. So yet again, Palestinians are being displaced inside Lebanon, inside the refugee camp. That is basically taken care of by UNRWA. Look, from my perspective, UNRWA is still a UN agency, right? And I know when I was in Gaza, I saw many things that made me question what exactly UNRWA's role was. And many people, even since October the 7th in Gaza, have accused UNRWA of effectively working with the Israelis to displace people from one area to the next and so on. In other words, they've gone along with Israeli policy rather than trying to stand against it on behalf of the Palestinians. So I do have, I have a slightly different perspective on UNRWA. However, it does employ a number of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank and even in Lebanon, who are responsible for their own people within those environments that they're in. But Israel's targeting of UNRWA, of course, it's to end any kind of UN assistance for the Palestinians. It's to basically completely isolate Palestinians, while Israel is effectively approving, I think it's something like between 700 and 900 new settlements in the West Bank. And of course, what we're seeing now is them destroying the infrastructure in the West Bank. They're bombing the West Bank. They're displacing people in the West Bank. They're encroaching on land, both in the West Bank and in the farmlands. We're seeing constant footage of settlers coming in and threatening Palestinian farmers, which is what they've always done. So they're encroaching further and further onto Palestinian territory, while everyone is, if you like, focused on what's happening in Gaza and in Lebanon and elsewhere. Sorry, go on.
So real quick, and was Jordan in all this, seeing as how they stood up really early and gave a big speech about how you can't cross that line to the West Bank. And here we are, back to your other point about a lot of nice words are being said, but no sanctions, no actual action against this. It's frustrating. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of, it's horrifying to me that we as ordinary people are being forced. I mean, every day I wake up, I don't want to open my phone.
Right.
I mean, literally the morning that I opened my phone and I just saw all these videos of burning human beings, I'm just like, what have we become? Yeah. What is happening to this world that this is becoming? And this is the thing, what they are doing, of course, is normalizing genocide. Exactly. They're literally saturating us, all of our sensory receptors are getting completely saturated with these images day in, day out. And it is literally being normalized because they're doing nothing about it.
It's unreal.
It is. It's really frightening for me, actually.
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, at some point, we'll be able to see where, whether this tapers down or whatever ends up happening, we'll be able to see, what the consequences were here. But it's hard to say whether this will be, I mean, obviously, the one, at least one of the positives around with all the terrible is that people are seeing things that they've never seen before. They're questioning things they've never questioned before. But to your point, is it is that going to be more important than whatever all this is accomplishing? You know, whether, I mean, even in conjunction with kind of this technocratic push, I mean, do we get to a point to where they just go, well, now we're at a point now where we don't care if you see what we're doing. We control, you know, well, I don't know, but go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. You mentioned, you know, the technocracy. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. No, but, you know, when you look at what is being developed to surveil Palestinians, not only to surveil Palestinians, but remotely kill Palestinians. I mean, now they're sending robots into Jabalia to lay explosive devices that just remotely kill civilians that happen to walk past when it's detonated, right? The remote control sniper rifles. Everything is becoming remote controlled. This is the dystopia that we have been talking about in the West, but it's being developed on the genocide of Palestinians. And when you look at, excuse me, the 2030 roadmap between Israel and the UK, and there's probably something very, very similar in the United States, all of this technology is being developed on the back of the genocide of Palestinians, but it's going to be used against us. This is the point. You know, we need to make the connection between what is happening in West Asia, what the resistance is trying to do, because the resistance are aware of Netanyahu's vision of a new order. They're very aware of it. People here in Syria are very aware of it. And they literally feel they are fighting this war for everybody. Because if this war is won by the Zionists and the US and the UK and so on, then we're living under such a kind of hideous reality paradigm. You know,
honestly, it was really quick. As much as I'm, you know, obviously what you just said is just kind of, I think I'm aware of that, Lizzie, but nonetheless, what you just said weirdly gave me like a very ominous feeling. Like, really think about what you just said. Like, it's obvious that my point is that if they win, then clearly they're still in control. But to think about what that means, we're watching people that the world can recognize beyond a shadow of a doubt being aware of committing genocide, and then not even just being a part of it, speaking up and saying, you should be praising us for doing this. It's the right thing. And
we're the civilized ones.
They would be in power. People would then bow. We need to recognize how important this is. You're absolutely right. There's more hinging on this than just the freedom of the Palestinian people or Lebanon or Syria. It's for all of us.
No. I mean, I get kind of goosebumps when I talk about this, because it's actually really, and honestly, on a personal level, people here are feeling anxious. They're feeling really anxious because they're feeling this is kind of an end game. And it's not only the end game for us, it's the end game for everyone. You know, and you know, when you look at an entity that is so crazy, it has a doctrine like the Samson doctrine, where if it is existentially threatened, it will use nuclear weapons, even against its allies. It doesn't care. Ariel Sharon basically said that in 2003. He said, we can target Paris, we can target anywhere in the world. That's who we're dealing with. We're not, and I'm not even saying they're irrational, because they're perfectly rational, both from a religious perspective, a historical perspective, an ideological perspective. They're perfectly rational in what they're doing. But from our perspective, they're completely irrational. Do you know what I mean? That's a good
way to put that. I was just going to say, I would argue that I think some of them are quite, maybe flirting with a line of being a little bit crazy, but I get what you're saying. They're very aware of what they're doing, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, they're not out of control, is what I'm saying.
Right.
They have an agenda. And they're working to that agenda. And we need to be like very aware of what that agenda is. And I mean, look, smart cities, who's making smart cities now in Nagorno-Karabakh? The formerly Armenian territory in Azerbaijan on the border with Iran, Israel. Why? Because they'll put the Armenians into those smart cities, basically into prisons where everything is controlled. We know what smart cities mean. But when, in my opinion, we're not making a strong enough connection between what's going on in Palestine and how that is going to affect us in the future from the perspective of what we've also been warning about from the technocratic perspective, if that makes sense.
100%. Well, we're at an interesting time right now where, I mean, and this is why a lot of, like myself included, would argue that's why a lot of this has been kind of, began to happen, because we have met that point where these long sought plans are now suddenly technologically possible. Israel, you know, and so I think you're right. And yeah, as we've seen over the years with Israel, where they sell, you know, I mean, publicly, weapons they're using on innocent people in Palestine as battle tested. It's exactly what you're highlighting. Is this is a testing ground, and these populations are being used. I mean, we recently saw some kind of random gas used against the UNIFIL UN location. You know, and it could just be the same old tear gas they use, which is not tear gas, or maybe it's something else. But it's very obvious that they know they can do this stuff and that nobody's holding them accountable, and that's a very unnerving reality for, as you're highlighting, because this is going to become our new normal should we not recognize this needs to be stopped. And that is an important thing to highlight. But I want, before we get away from it, I wanted to at least touch on, because it is a pretty big event in regard to what's going on with Sinwar and what just happened. And I brought up the UNRWA point, because this overlaps, because obviously I think that's very important, and the larger dynamic of how that plays out and what they're trying to sort of wipe away from history. But you recently shared this on Twitter, and I won't read the whole post, but essentially you can just tell us what's going on here. Omar from Gaza is highlighting how this passport is being used, saying he's an UNRWA teacher. They're claiming was found with Sinwar, but yet the person on this is claiming they're in Egypt. They don't know how it got there. And it essentially looks like Israel's yet again trying to frame the UNRWA overlap.
Yeah.
And go ahead and explain why and how that may.
You know, again, it's this criminalization of anyone that's working for UNRWA. In other words, trying to connect them to Hamas, that they have prescribed as a terrorist organization. And this passport that was found, and I'm not quite sure why it was found with Sinwar, you know, anything could have happened. It could have been planted at the scene. And who knows? They fabricated pretty much everything from October the 7th onwards. So I kind of, you know, I disbelieve virtually everything they say, to be honest.
I would argue it's as simple as just saying it's UNRWA on the thing. UNRWA. I mean, that's how simple this tends to be for their propaganda.
Exactly. You know, but the guy said that basically this was his old passport. He has a new passport now, and he's in Egypt. The passport has been renewed. But basically what this is doing is then normalizing the targeting of UNRWA employees in Gaza. And I have a friend who works for UNRWA who, thank God, is still alive. He's now in Deir al-Bala, where actually the burning tent horror happened the other day. So, you know, all of these people then, instead of working for a UN agency, they become aligned with Hamas. And then they're legitimate targets under Israel's rules-based genocidal order.
So UNRWA schools as well, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Right? We're just seeing that happen right after this, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So the point was, if you want anything you want to mention the relevance around Sinwar and how that went down, because it's interesting. And I'm still getting kind of into it since it happened. I was more kind of pulled away from everything yesterday. But so it's interesting to see how this all played out. Ultimately, he's found, you know, not in a tunnel full of civilians and all this, you know, so it's just interesting to see. So what do you take from that? And what is your read on the situation?
Well, I mean, I think what's really interesting, of course, is, you know, the claims were that they had identified the tunnel he was in, that they had basically managed to find Sinwar and were tracking him. And of course, now it's absolutely clear they weren't. They didn't even know they had killed him, basically. And I think, you know, they are sort of, and even I've seen Israeli military experts commenting today and saying, you know, actually this is a disaster for us, because the fact that Sinwar has been killed, literally he's died fighting. You know, so that has destroyed all of the Israeli propaganda. And actually there's nothing wrong, by the way, with fighting in tunnels. There's nothing wrong with the resistance using tunnels. It's virtually their only means to survive under, I mean, you know, how many 86 bombs were used to kill Sayyid Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. I mean, seriously, I'm not going to sort of, you know, resent anyone using tunnels in these circumstances.
On top of the fact that every other military we're discussing has used tunnels in some warfare dynamic. It's silly. It's only bad when they do
it's ridiculous. You know? Even the French resistance used them famously, of course, when the Nazis were occupying northern and southern France. But I think, you know, really his death and the way he was found, I think, is kind of really elevated him to a symbol of strength for the resistance. And I think, if anything, it's going to strengthen the resolve of the resistance, because their elected leader was found, I mean, his arm missing, he'd been hit by shrapnel, you know, he still managed to throw the stick at the drone that was coming in to finish him off, and then got done in by a sniper. I mean, someone mentioned it's something like a scene out of Terminator, but it's real life, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, go on, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to bring it. So it's interesting to see how, you know, the narrative is always there and ever present. It's sort of how we can see Baghdadi or anybody else be killed 14 times until, you know, we never really know what's going on. So the takeaway obviously is that this is a war of propaganda, as it always becomes. And how this played out, it shows you, to your other point, I think, which is important. And I think even Hamas put out a statement today or yesterday saying something of the same effect, that ultimately that this is only going to inspire more people to fight back and give, you know, that many times over the years you pretend like taking our leaders has caused anything to stop. It only grows stronger, you know. So I agree. And I think that the way it went down is only going to hurt them. And even the fact that it got leaked out without their knowledge, I mean, it's just, it all seems so...
It kind of makes them look pretty useless, because, I mean, you know, if they had killed him, they hadn't even checked that it was Sinwar. So, you know, I think... I think what you will probably see is Hamas to a degree. I don't know if they will elect another single leader, because, you know, Israel now clearly has a policy of picking off the leadership. Of course, the resistance has a very horizontal leadership anyway, and that's been proven with the operations that Hezbollah is conducting in the south. I mean, you've got 4 or 5 Hezbollah taking out, you know, a squad of Israelis that, and they haven't managed to advance more than about 1 kilometer into southern Lebanon. And that's despite the carpet bombing, the detonation, the artillery. So, you know, it's kind of an extraordinary effort if you think about it. They don't have an air force. They don't really have, you know, air defense as such. But Israel is failing really to advance further than just simply bombing everything in sight. And of course, that's what it's always been good at anyway. You know, using disproportionate force and cruelty and savagery against what are predominantly civilians.
Yeah. And based off the Iran engagement, the same way. I mean, again, it's almost incredible how clumsy this has been, and how every single time it's the reactive type propaganda, and the lie gets exposed, and the governments and a lot of the corporate media just don't acknowledge that fact, like that Iran only hit military targets, killed no one, and yet we're arguing it's their belligerent terrorism versus Israel's indiscriminate civilian killing targets that are precise. It's become a joke. It really has. And this is why it's so incredible that this continues to just goose step forward, if you will, where people are just mindlessly going along with what this is. And it's a very small minority. I argue even within our political dynamic in the United States, like people are left or right. I ask, and it's interesting. But so to kind of end on this point in regard to, you know, where this goes. So we didn't touch on Lebanon that much. So if you want to touch on, you know, what you see, how you see that playing in, not, I mean, you go into it as much as you'd like, and let, you know, where you see this going. With that point being the idea, you know, so it's obvious that I don't see how they can succeed in any real, like, unless that is really just sort of military belligerent control of the U.S. and Israel in this dynamic going forward, and using that to effectively take more control. Maybe that's how it goes. But everyone in the world seems to be acknowledging what this is and sort of like waiting for it to finish, which makes me sick. Right. But so how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think you've got levels of conflict in Lebanon. So you've got the military conflict, which is ongoing at the moment. Hezbollah is talking about taking escalatory measures now. You know, it's recognized now as a war. It's no longer a kind of a war of attrition or a war of distraction away from the, you know, to take the Israeli military away from the Gaza front, etc. Now it's an all-out war. And that's been made very clear by Hezbollah. I think what's interesting is that today there was a UNIFIL German naval vessel that intercepted a resistance drone Now, that shouldn't be happening. That is suggesting that UNIFIL is basically partisan towards Israel, and that UNIFIL's role, which of course Israel perceives as effectively occupying the southern territories, once they've cleansed them of Hezbollah, which is what they're aiming for, to arrive at the Litani River and to push Hezbollah back beyond the Litani River and to introduce the UNIFIL forces and the Lebanese army. Well, the Lebanese army isn't actually capable of taking care of that level of territory. But it also suggests that UNIFIL is going to be playing not a neutral role, but a role that is favorable towards Israeli occupation of that territory. Again, that's my reading of the situation. But then you've also got the internal war, which is now being, fomented very much by the US and the UK. The British intelligence has been working there for years, just as they were in Syria, to identify opposition to Hezbollah, and not only to Hezbollah, I mean to Amal, to the Christian factions that are allied with Hezbollah. You know, Hezbollah isn't some kind of sectarian faction that the West would love you to believe.
Right.
And as someone pointed out to me the other day, a young Lebanese, I'll get it right, Arab Lebanese Christian journalist, right? Because she's very clear. She said, this is an Arab war for liberation from the Crusader, the neo-Crusaders. It never ended. The Crusades never ended. So how she perceives it, and it's a very good way of perceiving it because it takes away all of the sectarian discourse and propaganda, is as Arabs supporting Arabs to take back Arab land from Western and Israeli occupation and plundering of resources. So I think, that should be very clearly made, that point, because when people talk about, well, Hezbollah protects Christians, no, Arabs protect Arabs, because Christians and Shia Muslim and Sunni Muslim and Yazidi and Ismaili and so on have coexisted in Syria and in Lebanon for centuries, right? But what the US and the UK and British, particularly MI6, British intelligence, have been working on is infiltration of government sectors, military sectors, security sectors. Britain has installed watchtowers that are being used to surveil the territory, both Syria side and Lebanon side. And what they're trying to now do is to manufacture a situation where they can turn the factions that are against Hezbollah against them to impose a president, because if people don't know, Lebanon still only has really an interim government. Hezbollah has 13 seats, I think, from the 2022 election. So it's an official member of the political sphere in Lebanon. Again, that, of course, is not told to you in the US or the UK or the EU. Right. And they're in a coalition with a Christian party, a Christian nationalist party. But anyway, so it's like, so in other words, there are two wars going on here. And of course, if Israel is perceived to be not achieving its goals in the south, then there is potential for a destabilization campaign to turn the population against Hezbollah. And of course, how will they do that if Israel bombs deeper into Beirut territory, for example, or deeper into areas where they're not only Hezbollah, there might be other Christian factions like the Phalangists, who, by the way, are Christian Zionists, although that's an oxymoron, but they are Christians who support Zionism and who carried out the massacre in 1982 in Sabra and Shatila of Palestinians, more than 3,000 Palestinians massacred by the Phalangists, watched over by the Zionists. So there are factions in Lebanon that can be weaponized against Hezbollah, and I think there is very high potential for that happening. So, it's an incredibly complex situation. As I said, here in Syria, we're watching literally on tenterhooks. We're stuck here now because all the border roads have been basically bombed. There is a vulnerability in the south of Syria for Israel to advance or to certainly bomb to a large degree, but I don't think we're at that stage quite yet, but I could be wrong, because things do suddenly seem to escalate very, very fast at the moment.
Well, I ultimately hope that, some people out there can influence, whatever I mean, there's so many different dynamics involved. And I think that people out there need to take the actions they believe will have an influence on stopping what's happening, whatever that may be to you. Because I think right now there's a lot of, I tend to lean away from the political action. I don't think your politicians care, but if you think it'll make a difference, give it a shot. Because I think what we need to do right now is everything in our power to try to stop the suffering of these people. The problem for me immediate is that it does just seem like everyone's sort of letting this finish. Everyone being the wrong term, I guess, but the power structures, and it's something that I'm having a hard time with. Like that. As much as I think we're doing what's within our power, it just continues without the facts, everything aside. It's hard, So thank you for being here and enlightening people on this, and hopefully we can take some more action to see this change. And I do believe that we're on as much as there's a lot of negative, a lot of sadness, a lot of pain and suffering, there is some good coming from this, and that's what I was saying before, is that more people than ever are seeing what I think is the real culprit in all of this. And I just mean that whether we're talking about Zionism or in specific cases, the U.S. government, but we can see who are obviously behind a lot of this. And so I'll end by just pointing this out, since we mentioned this earlier. And I think I did pulled up, I didn't grab it. And on the point that I think it's important to realize that the U.S. government is playing a central role in this. Like I think you've mentioned in the past, this is not, they're not supporting this. This is a U.S. genocide in regard to what's going on in Gaza. The U.S. and Israel are equally complicit. And as Kavak Al-Macian highlights him back to Syria, the CIA-backed terrorists from the Saad bin Abi Waqas Brigade, affiliated with Hayat al-Sham or Al-Qaeda, have released a video showing them preparing for a major assault on Syrian Arab army positions. This offensive is clearly designed to divert Syrian forces, paving the way for Israel's potential expansion of the war into Syria. So just like you're highlighting, it's all, these pieces are coming into place. So, I mean, any last thoughts on, what can somebody do out there? The average person who's watching this that goes, I don't have any influence, I don't have a channel, but I'd like to see something, I'd like to do something. What would you say they could do?
Actually, I did see someone do something the other day, which I just thought was brilliant. And they basically went to one of these military industrial complex exhibitions, expos, whatever. I think it was in the States. And they went to all of did you see it? All the Israeli weapons manufacturers and basically shoved the camera in their face and said, so are you going to keep selling weapons that are shredding children, that are, and, really loudly? So I think, I think there's a lot of things that can be done, even outside of the demonstrations and the protests, which, are amazing in solidarity with Palestine. But I think there's a lot of other things that you can do personally as well. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of countries now blockading seaports and preventing shipping going to Israel. You have to kind of think of the supply chain. And then pick an area of that supply chain where you can have an effect, or where you can potentially draw attention to and shame the companies and the individuals that are profiting from the mass slaughter of Palestinians and Lebanese now. I mean, what is it? 2,500 dead and 10,000 injured. I mean, we're just entering the same paradigm of kind of ever increasing numbers, and it's just horrifying.
It is. Well, and I think that's the shame and there's a lot of companies out there. Like, I think on a lot of cases, I think these people are pretty much sociopaths and wouldn't care. But I think there is an element of these companies that see an opportunity to profit, and they don't see anybody getting held accountable. And so they step into it. But yes, should they be called out? Should their name be shown on Twitter or whatever platform you're using next to these images? I think they might think twice about that. So I agree. And so anything like that, just take action, guys. Stand up and do something. And I'm never advocating for violence, but I believe the time is where now is the time to find what you can do to make a difference. So I'm going to end actually with a clip, since you be mentioning the shredded children, one of the most impactful videos from a doctor highlighting what he's seeing in Gaza. So I'll end with that clip. And anything else you want to leave us with on the way out, Vanessa? Any upcoming events or anything you want to leave us with to let people know what's coming up?
No, I mean, people can follow my work at my Substack is the main one, Twitter, YouTube still, and Telegram, of course, these days is, the most used for me. But no, thanks, Ryan, and thanks for highlighting everything you do. It is really important, I think, support the resistance, because they're ordinary people. They're not governments. They're just people like us across the world, you know, who are fighting back against what, you know, evil is always an overused word, but I can't think of another word to describe what's actually going on at the moment.
I agree. Well, like you said, support the resistance, because you are the resistance. So thank you for being here, Vanessa. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
When were you in Gaza?
End of April for the first couple of weeks. And then there's sniper bullets. I have children that were shot twice.
Wait, you're saying that children in Gaza are being shot by snipers?
Definitively. I have 2 children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately, and directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best sniper. And they're dead center shots.
In fact, more than 20 doctors recently in Gaza also told Sunday Morning about gunshot wounds to children. One American doctor told us he even reviewed CT scans to confirm what he saw because he, quote, didn't believe that this many children could be admitted to a single hospital with gunshot wounds to the head. Some shootings have been captured on video.
So, of all the disaster zones you've seen, how does Gaza compare?
All of the disasters I've seen combined, 40 mission trips, 30 years, ground zero, earthquakes, all of that combined doesn't equal the level of carnage that I saw against civilians in just my first week in Gaza.
And when you say civilians, is it mostly children?
Almost exclusively children. I've never seen that before. Never seen that. I've seen more incinerated children than I've ever seen in my entire life combined. I've seen more shredded children in just the first week.
Shredded?
Shredded.
What do you mean?
Missing body parts, being crushed by buildings, the greatest majority, or bomb explosions, the next greatest majority. We've taken shrapnel as big as my thumb out of 8-year-olds.
The UN reports that to date, more than 80% of Gaza's population has been displaced and the majority of its buildings destroyed. A reality which has taken its own toll on the well-being of children.
What about the emotional wounds?
How can you measure that? I can't measure my own. How do you be an orphan and watching your family, melted in front of you and shredded in front of you? How do you fix that? Ever fix that?
In fact, so many Palestinian children have had family members killed that doctors created a shorthand term, WCNSF, wounded child, no surviving family.